Sister left her umbrella at my house the afternoon of the funeral reception, and I didn't think anything of it at the time. It was one of those grey October afternoons you get in Nova Scotia. The kind where the light never quite arrives and the cold settles into the walls of the house, no matter how high you turn the heat. We'd buried my wife Carol that morning. 41 years we were married. 41 years. And then, a Tuesday in October when I came home from the grocery store and found her on the kitchen floor, already gone. The coroner said cardiac arrest. Quick, he said, like that was supposed to be a comfort. After the service, people came back to the house. My sister-in-law Barbara, Carol's younger sister, and her husband Frank were there, my daughter Heather, some neighbors from our street, people from Carol's book club. I moved through all of it in a fog. Someone put a plate of food in my hand, and I set it down somewhere and never found it again. Barbara and Frank stayed until almost 8, tidying up the kitchen, wrapping the casserole dishes people had brought. I told them I was fine, that I just needed to sleep. They left. I locked the front door and sat in the living room in the dark for a long time. That was 14 months ago. The umbrella came later, almost a year after Carol was gone, during one of Barbara's regular visits. She'd been coming by every few weeks, which I appreciated. Frank usually came too, but that particular Sunday he had a hockey thing with his son from his first marriage, so it was just Barbara. We had tea. She asked how I was sleeping. She said she'd been thinking about listing the cottage up in Cape Breton. Said it was too much upkeep now that Carol wasn't around to share it with. I said that was probably smart. We talked about Heather, who had just gotten a promotion at the hospital where she works as a nurse in Halifax. Barbara said she was proud of her. I said I was too. When she left, I walked her to her car. It was a blustery afternoon. Her hair kept getting in her face. She forgot the umbrella on the hook by the door. I brought it inside and set it in the front closet and forgot about it. 3 days later, I was looking for my own umbrella. There's a whole pile of them in that closet. Carol used to collect them from lost and found bins at the community center. And when I pulled Barbara's out by mistake, something slipped from the handle and landed on the floor. It was folded in half, tucked between the handle and the wrist strap. A single sheet of paper. I almost didn't unfold it. I thought it was maybe a receipt, a grocery list, something she'd shoved in her pocket and forgot about. But it was too stiff for that. Heavier. I unfolded it on the kitchen table and stood there reading it for a long time without fully understanding what I was reading. It was a letter. From a law firm in Dartmouth I didn't recognize, Mackenzie-in-law, Family and Estate Law. Dated 8 months before Carol died. The letter was addressed to Barbara and Frank. It was a summary of a consultation they'd had, reviewing the terms of Carol's will and what would happen to her assets, including our joint ownership of the Cape Breton property, in the event of her death if she predeceased me. There were notes in the margins, handwritten. Barbara's handwriting, question marks next to certain figures. A supple sentence near the bottom that I had to read 3 times before it stopped feeling like the floor was tinting under my feet. The sentence said, in the event the surviving spouse also predeceases the named beneficiary, the full estate transfers unconditionally. The named beneficiary in Carol's will was Barbara. I put the paper down. I picked it up again. I read the date again, 8 months before Carol died, before she had any reason to die. She'd had a checkup the previous spring and everything was fine. She was 63 years old. She walked every morning. She gardened. She had no history of heart problems. I thought about the word unconditionally. I thought about Barbara asking about the Cape Breton cottage that afternoon, so casually, like it was just a practical matter, an inconvenience to be sorted. I sat at that kitchen table for maybe 2 hours. Then I called Heather. She drove up from Halifax the next morning. I made coffee and put the paper on the table between us and let her read it. She was quiet for a long time after. Dad, she said, how long has she had this? I don't know. It was folded up in her umbrella. Why would she stopped. She picked up the paper and looked at the date again. This was 8 months before Mom died. I know. That doesn't mean anything necessarily, she said, but she didn't sound like she believed it. She never mentioned it to me, I said. Not once. In 14 months, she's been in this house dozens of times. She never said anything about having met with a lawyer about your mother's estate while your mother was still alive. Heather looked at me. She has Carol's eyes, the pale grey-green that changes depending on the light. What are you thinking? I don't know what I'm thinking. That's why I called you. We sat there with it for a while. Then Heather said something that I hadn't let myself think yet. She said, Mom's doctor always seemed a little uncertain about the cardiac arrest. Do you remember? He said her last blood work was unusual. He mentioned it at the hospital, and then nothing ever came of it. I remembered. Dr. Witchfield had pulled me aside in the hallway at the hospital after they'd brought Carol in. He'd said the blood panel showed some irregularities that he wanted to flag. He said it quietly, carefully, the way doctors speak when they're not sure yet and don't want to cause unnecessary alarm. I'd been too shattered to ask the right questions. I'd assumed it was just the way these things go, that sometimes the body gives no warning, and the tests afterwards tell you nothing useful. I hadn't followed up. I hadn't followed up. I called Dr. Whitfield's office the next morning. He wasn't available, but I left a message explaining that I had some questions about my wife's case, that something had come to my attention, and that I needed to speak with him. He called back that same afternoon. He was careful. He said he couldn't discuss specifics over the phone, but that he'd been glad I called, and could I come in. I went in on Thursday. Heather came with me. Dr. Whitfield is a quiet man, the kind who measures every word. He sat across from us and he said that at the time of Carol's death, the blood work had flagged an elevated concentration of a particular substance, a cardiac glycoside, that in large doses can cause fatal arrhythmia. He said it was consistent with an overdose of digoxin, which is a medication sometimes prescribed for certain heart conditions. Carol had not been prescribed digoxin. She had no prescription for it at all. He said he had flagged it in his notes. He said the findings had been passed to the coroner's office. He said as far as he knew, the coroner had attributed the elevated levels to her cardiac event rather than as a cause of it. Heather grabbed my hand under the chair. I asked him directly, was it possible that someone had given Carol digoxin without her knowledge? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes, it was possible. In large enough doses, it could be administered without the person being aware. It would be odorless, largely tasteless if diluted in a beverage, and the cardiac arrest it produced would look, on initial assessment, like a natural death. On the drive home, neither of us spoke for a long time. It was Heather who said finally, we have to go to the police. I'd been thinking about the visits. Barbara came over twice a week in the months after Carol was diagnosed with what turned out to be nothing. A routine scan that showed a small irregularity that resolved on its own. But Barbara had been here. She brought food. She poured tea. She was always in the kitchen, always offering, always nearby. I thought of it as kindness. I'd been grateful. I thought about the digoxin. I thought about how easy it would be to bring a small bottle of something in your purse and empty it into someone's tea when they stepped out of the room for a moment. I thought about how long she might have been waiting and planning and visiting. I thought about the letter in the umbrella, the handwritten notes in the margins, the circle sentence. I thought about Frank, who had been here too, often. Quiet, helpful Frank, who never said much but was always there, always willing to carry things, to drive places, to stay late, who stood at Carol's grave and wept convincingly. I said, I know. We went to the RCMP detachment in Truro 2 days later. I brought the letter. Heather brought the note she'd taken after our meeting with Dr. Whitfield. The officer who took our statement, a woman named Corporal Lessard, listened without expression for a long time. She asked careful questions. She asked if Carol had had any other medication in the house that could have been tampered with. She asked about Barbara and Frank's financial situation, which I realized I knew very little about. She asked about the Cape Breton property specifically, its estimated value, who had access to it, whether there had been any recent discussions about selling it. The property was worth somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000. Carol and I had bought it in 1998 for $80,000. I hadn't thought about it in those terms in a long time. Corporal Lazar told us to go home and not to contact Barbara or Frank. She said the matter would be reviewed. She said she couldn't tell us more than that. Her voice was professionally neutral, but there was something in her eyes, not quite urgency, but attention. The kind of attention that meant she didn't think we were wasting her time. What followed was the most disorienting weeks of my life, which is saying something, because the weeks after Carol died were not exactly peaceful. I went through the motions of my days, making coffee, watching the news, walking the dog, and all the while I was carrying this thing around inside me that had no name yet. It wasn't grief. I'd been grieving for over a year. This was something colder, something that sat in my chest and didn't move. Barbara called twice during that period. I answered. I talked to her the way I always had. Careful, warm, ordinary. She asked about Thanksgiving, whether I was coming to her place or whether she should come to mine. I said I wasn't sure yet. I said I'd let her know. My voice was steady. I don't know how. Heather called every evening. Sometimes we talked for an hour. Sometimes we just sat on the phone not saying much, which was enough. 6 weeks after we went to the RCMP, Corporal Lessard called me. She asked if I could come in again. I brought Heather. The coroner's office had reviewed Carol's case. Given the new information, particularly the blood work results, which had been preserved, they had concluded that the elevated digoxin levels were inconsistent with a natural cardiac event and were more consistent with the administration of an external source. The case had been reclassified. My wife's death was now being investigated as a homicide. I'd known on some level since I read that letter on the kitchen table. But hearing the word out loud, homicide, was different. Heather made a sound beside me that she quickly swallowed. I put my hand on her shoulder. Corporal Lessard told us that a search warrant had been executed at Barbara and Frank's home in Dartmouth. She told us that investigators had found, among other things, a small brown glass bottle in the back of a bathroom cabinet that had been wiped down but not thoroughly enough. She told us that text messages between Barbara and Frank going back 18 months before Carol's death discussed the contents of Carol's will, the value of their estate, and in several exchanges expressed frustration that Carol and I were both in good health. One message, she said, Frank had written, "How much longer are we supposed to wait?" Barbara had replied, "Not much longer. I just need the right moment." I have thought about that message every day since. Not much longer. The right moment. My wife made tea every afternoon at 4 o'clock. She never changed that ritual. Barbara knew that. Barbara had been in our kitchen hundreds of times. Over 40 years. She knew where everything was. She knew Carol would offer to refill her cup and then step away to the stove, because that's what Carol did, every single time. Not much longer. Barbara and Frank were arrested on a Wednesday morning in late February. Heather was with me when Corporal Lessard called to let us know. I sat down on the couch and didn't get up for a while. Heather sat next to me and we didn't talk much. The trial lasted 11 days. I was there for most of it. I sat in the gallery and watched the lawyers lay out piece by piece what had been done to Carol and why, the digoxin, the text messages, the legal consultation, the insurance policy on Carol's life that Barbara had secretly been named a beneficiary on 20 years ago and never disclosed, a policy that would pay out $280,000. Frank's lawyer argued that his client had been a passive participant, that the planning had been Barbara's, that Frank had known but had not acted. The judge was not persuaded. He noted that Frank's messages were active, not passive. He noted that Frank had been present in the house on at least 3 of the occasions that investigators believed the digoxin had been administered. The pathologist testified that Carol had likely received multiple small doses over a period of several weeks, not one large dose. That meant more than one opportunity. That meant more than one visit, more than one cup of tea. Barbara received 22 years without eligibility for parole. Frank received 16. Under the Criminal Code of Canada, they will both be in their 80s before any possibility of release. I still have the umbrella. I don't know why. It's in the front closet, still, with all of Carol's umbrella collection. I should probably throw it out. I haven't been able to. Heather drove up last weekend. We took the dog out to the beach at Crystal Crescent and walked for a long time without saying much. The water was that flat silver color it gets in late autumn, and there was barely anyone around. The dog kept running in and out of the waves and then shaking herself all over us, and we kept laughing at her. That surprised, involuntary kind of laughing that you forget is possible for a while, and then suddenly it's there again. On the drive back, Heather said, "I think Mom would have been glad we didn't let it go." I said I thought so too. Carol was not a woman who let things go unanswered. She was precise and thorough, and she believed that things ought to be dealt with honestly, even when it was hard. She used to say that the truth has a way of insisting on itself eventually, that you can bury it under whatever you like, but it keeps working its way back to the surface. I think about that letter folded into the wrist strap of an umbrella, waiting in the front closet for 3 days before I found it. I think about how easily I could have just handed it back to Barbara without looking, how close it came to staying buried. I am 67 years old. I have a daughter who calls every evening. I have a dog who rolls in seaweed. I have a house full of Carol's umbrellas and her gardening books and the munch she used every morning that I still can't put away. I have the truth. That's what I have left. And it turns out it's enough to keep going. I've thought a lot about the umbrella. Not the letter inside it. The umbrella itself. A cheap thing. Black. The kind you forget you own. Carol would have laughed at the idea that something so ordinary could matter so much. She always said the smallest things hold the most. I didn't understand what she meant until I was standing in the front closet with that folded piece of paper in my hand. My whole understanding of the past 14 months rearranging itself around a date printed in plain type. Barbara came to Carol's funeral and wept. She sat at my kitchen table and drank my tea and asked how I was sleeping. She came back week after week, and I call it kindness because I needed to call it something. That's what grief does. It makes you grateful for presence, any presence, without stopping to ask what that presence is costing you. I was so busy being destroyed by Carol's absence that I never looked carefully at who was filling the space she left behind. What strikes me now is not the evil of it, though the evil is real. What strikes me is the patience. 18 months of planning, years maybe, of watching and waiting and calculating. That kind of patience requires a certain kind of clarity. A decision made and kept and never reconsidered. I don't know how a person arrives at that place. I don't think I want to know. But I do know that it fails, eventually, because that kind of thinking is always building on a foundation that doesn't hold. You can plan for everything except the umbrella left on the hook by the door. Heather is the reason any of this came to light, really. Not because she found the letter. I found that. But because when I called her, she came. She sat across the table and she didn't tell me I was imagining things, or that I needed to grieve properly, or that Barbara would never. She listened. She asked the right questions. She remembered the conversation with Dr. Whitfield that I had filed away under things too painful to examine. She held the thread steady when I couldn't. That steadiness, the willingness to look at something frightening and stay present anyway, is not a small thing. I don't take it for granted anymore. I've learned something in the past year that I couldn't have learned any other way. I've learned that paying attention is an act of love, but it's also something you owe yourself. Not suspicion, attention. There's a difference. Carol trusted freely and completely, and that was one of her finest qualities, and it was used against her. I don't think the answer is to stop trusting, but I think there's a kind of clear-eyed honesty we owe the people we love, and ourselves, where we don't explain away the things that don't quite fit, where we follow the question to the end instead of setting it down because the answer might be uncomfortable. The truth came out because I unfolded a piece of paper, but it stayed hidden for 14 months because I hadn't asked the right questions, hadn't pushed on the loose floorboard of Dr. Whitfield's careful wording, hadn't let myself sit with the discomfort of not knowing. I'm not punishing myself for that. I was grieving. But I carry it now as a reminder that clarity requires courage. The quiet, ordinary kind, not the dramatic kind. The kind that makes you pick up the phone and make the appointment and walk into the office and say, I need to know the truth, even if it's hard. Barbara and Frank are in their 70s now. They will likely die in prison. I don't feel satisfaction about that. Exactly. I feel something quieter. A sense that the world corrected itself. That the weight redistributed the way weight eventually does. Carol deserved better than what happened to her. She deserved to grow old in the house she loved, with the dog she fussed over, and the garden she kept, and the daughter who has her eyes. She didn't get that, but she got this. The truth finally, spoken out loud in a courtroom, on the record, permanent. That's what I have to give her now. It's not enough, but it's what I have.